The year is 1821. The island of Saint Helena sits beneath a grey Atlantic sky, isolated in the vast emptiness of the South Atlantic, a prison of rock and wind and endless ocean. And in a dim room within Longwood House, a man lies in bed, his body weakened by what history will call stomach cancer, his skin pallid, his breathing shallow, his companions gathered around him expecting the end at any moment. But tonight, in this telling, something shifts, something fundamental. An inexplicable occurs in the fabric of reality itself. The pain recedes like a tide withdrawing from the shore. The fever breaks as though a spell has been lifted, and Napoleon Bonaparte opens his eyes to a dawn he was never meant to see. He rises, slowly at first, testing limbs that should be failing, feeling the strange lightness of a body that has passed through the valley of death and emerged on the other side, untouched, unchanged, and somehow eternal. The British guards outside his door hear movement, footsteps on the wooden floor, the sound of a window opening to let in the salt air, and they glance at one another with confusion and growing unease, because the reports had said he was dying, that the end was near, that the emperor who had reshaped Europe would soon be nothing but memory and legend and cautionary tale. But he does not die. Days pass, then weeks, and the color returns to his cheeks like spring returning to frozen earth. The strength flows back into his limbs, his appetite returns, and the physicians shake their heads in bewilderment, calling it a miracle, a remission, a strange turn of fate that defies all medical understanding and challenges everything they know about the progression of disease. Napoleon himself says nothing of it, reveals no thoughts on this impossible recovery, only stares out at the endless ocean that has been his prison for 6 years and wonders if this is punishment or gift, curse or providence, divine intervention or cosmic accident. He does not know, not yet, that he will never die, that the years ahead will stretch into decades, the decades into centuries, and that he will walk through time as a ghost made flesh, watching empires rise and fall like waves, technologies bloom and wither like flowers, and the world he once knew transform into something utterly unrecognizable. For now, he simply breathes the salt air, and waits, and remembers the coronation in Notre Dame when he placed the crown upon his own head in that audacious gesture that defined his reign, the artillery thunder at Austerlitz when his genius shone brightest and 3 emperors clashed in the Moravian snow, the fires of Moscow burning against the autumn sky as his greatest triumph turned to his greatest disaster, the snow of the retreat when the Grand Army dissolved in the Russian winter, the final desperate charge at Waterloo when everything came crashing down in mud and blood, and the realization that even he could not overcome destiny, all of it still vivid, still burning in his mind like yesterday, because for him there will be no fading, no merciful forgetting, only the endless accumulation of memory upon memory, year upon year, until the weight of it becomes almost unbearable. But that is still to come. For now, on this island prison in the South Atlantic, Napoleon Bonaparte simply lives, and the world does not yet know what that will mean. The British do not release him, not immediately, not for many years yet. They are deeply suspicious of his recovery, fearful that it is a ruse, a ploy, another of the Corsican's legendary tricks to escape and return to France and ignite another war that will consume Europe once more. So he remains on Saint Helena, year after year, as the 1820s pass into the 1830s, and the world beyond the island changes in ways he can only glimpse through newspapers that arrive months late and letters that have been read and censored by his captors. He hears of revolutions in South America, of Simon Bolivar and José de San Martín liberating colonies from Spanish rule and creating new nations in the image of republican ideals, and he wonders if his own conquests inspired them, if the example of France throwing off monarchy influenced these distant struggles. He hears of Greek independence, of Byron dying at Missolonghi, of the Ottoman Empire slowly crumbling, and he remembers his own Egyptian campaign, his dreams of Eastern conquest, the way the Orient had fascinated him as a young general seeking glory. He hears of the death of his old nemesis Tsar Alexander, and he feels a strange emptiness, because his great adversaries are dying while he continues, and soon there will be no one left who remembers Austerlitz and Friedland and the Treaty of Tilsit when they embraced as brothers and divided Europe between them. He writes endlessly, filling journals with reflections on his campaigns, his victories, his mistakes, the moments when fortune turned against him and he failed to turn it back. He rewrites the invasion of Russia in his mind 1,000 times, wondering if he had turned back at Smolensk, if he had waited for reinforcements, if he had not trusted in the speed of his advance, if he had not believed that taking Moscow would force Alexander to surrender, would the ancient capital still have burned? Would the Grand Army have survived the winter? Would he still be Emperor of France and master of Europe? But these are questions without answers, ghosts of a past that cannot be changed no matter how many times he revisits it in memory and imagination. And as the years accumulate with relentless monotony, he begins to notice something strange, something that fills him first with curiosity and then with growing dread. He does not age. His hair remains dark where it should be graying, his skin smooth where it should be wrinkling, his body strong where it should be weakening with the passage of time, while his guards grow old and are replaced by younger men, while his companions in exile sicken and die one by one, leaving him increasingly alone, while the world around him marches forward into a future he cannot join and cannot escape. In 1835, after 14 years of this impossible stasis, the British finally agree to release him, not out of mercy or justice, but because they believe he is no longer a threat, that the world has moved on, that France has a new king and Europe a new balance of power established at the Congress of Vienna, and that an aging relic of a bygone era can do no harm wandering the continent as a private citizen. They do not realize that he has not aged at all, that the man they release is physically identical to the man they imprisoned, unchanged by time in a way that should be impossible. He returns to Europe, not to France, which is still forbidden to him by treaty and royal decree, but to Switzerland, to a quiet villa near Lake Geneva, where he lives under an assumed name and watches from a safe distance as his nephew, Louis Napoleon, begins to rise in French politics, trading on the Bonaparte name, the Bonaparte legend, the myth of the uncle who died in exile and became a symbol of French glory and lost grandeur. By the time the 1840s arrive, bringing with them the railway age and the telegraph and the first stirrings of industrial revolution that will transform the world more profoundly than any military conquest, he has fully realized the truth of his condition. He is immortal, unchanging, bound to this earth in a way that defies all natural law and philosophical understanding. He does not know why, does not know if it is divine will or cosmic accident or some strange twist of fate written into the fabric of reality itself, but he accepts it, as he accepted exile, as he accepted defeat, with the cold pragmatism of a man who has learned to endure whatever fortune brings. He moves through Europe like a shadow, never staying in one place too long, never forming deep attachments, never revealing who he truly is, always aware that discovery would bring consequences he cannot predict. In 1848, when revolution sweeps across the continent like wildfire, when thrones topple and barricades rise in Paris and Vienna and Berlin and a dozen other capitals, when the old order that defeated him trembles and nearly falls, he watches from the sidelines with complicated emotions, remembering his own revolution, the one he inherited from Robespierre and the Jacobins, the one he shaped and tamed and ultimately betrayed when he crowned himself emperor and restored the very monarchy France had worked so hard to destroy. He wonders if he should have done things differently, if he should have remained first consul, if he should have been content with reforming France rather than conquering Europe, if his ambition was his fatal flaw or his greatest virtue. And these questions have no answers, only the endless circular reasoning of regret. The revolutions of 1848 burned themselves out as quickly as they ignited, consumed by their own contradictions and the resistance of entrenched power, leaving only exhaustion and disillusionment in their wake, and Napoleon understands this pattern all too well. His nephew becomes president of France in the aftermath, elected on promises of order and glory and restoration of French greatness, and then, in 1852, in an act that mirrors his uncle's own trajectory, crowns himself Emperor Napoleon III, and the old Napoleon watches this coronation from a distance, standing in a crowd in Paris, his face hidden beneath a hat and scarf, and he feels a strange mixture of pride and sadness and apprehension, because he sees in this new emperor the echo of his own ambitions, his own mistakes, the same hunger for glory that led him to Russia and Waterloo and ultimate disaster. He wants to approach him, to warn him, to tell him that empires are fragile things built on foundations of sand, that they rise and fall like tides, that glory is fleeting and history unforgiving, and the price of ambition is often paid in blood and suffering. But he says nothing, only turns and walks away, disappearing into the streets of a Paris he barely recognizes anymore. A city that has grown and changed and modernized while he remained frozen in time like an insect trapped in amber. The Second Empire rises with fanfare and optimism and dreams of restoring France to its rightful place among the great powers, and Napoleon Bonaparte becomes a wanderer, a silent witness to the unfolding of the 19th century in all its violence and progress and contradiction. He travels to Italy, to Germany, to England, to Spain, always careful to avoid recognition, always aware that his face, though unchanging, is known from 1,000 portraits and engravings and statues that populate museums and public squares across Europe. He grows a beard, cuts his hair short, wears spectacles that alter the shape of his face, adopts the manners and dress of the middle class, learns to speak with different accents, and thus disguised, he moves through the world like a ghost among the living, observing but not participating, remembering but not revealing. In 1859, he is in Italy when the Second Italian War of Independence erupts, when French and Piedmontese forces clash with the Austrians at Magenta and Solferino in battles that will inspire the creation of the Red Cross, and he watches from a hillside, seeing the tactics he pioneered now employed by a new generation of generals who learned warfare from studying his campaigns, seeing the massed columns and the artillery barrages and the cavalry charges that once brought him victory, now producing only slaughter and stalemate. The bloodshed sickens him now in a way it did not before, perhaps because he has had time to reflect, to remember the faces of the men who died under his command, the hundreds of thousands who fell in Spain and Russia and Germany and France, all for his glory, his ambition, his dream of a united Europe under French rule and Enlightenment principles. He wonders if any of it was worth it, if the Code Napoleon and the administrative reforms and the roads and bridges and the rational reorganization of society justify the rivers of blood that were spilled. And he does not know, cannot know, because history is not a ledger that can be balanced with simple arithmetic, because human lives cannot be weighed against abstract achievements, because the dead remain dead no matter how great the monument built in their name. In 1870, his nephew's empire collapses after defeat at Sedan, the emperor captured by the Prussians, Paris besieged and starving, and Napoleon I watches from Brussels as the city he loves endures famine and bombardment and the horrors of the Commune, when Frenchmen kill Frenchmen in the streets and the dream of the revolution devours itself once more. He wants to return, to help, to do something to stop the suffering, but what can he do? He is a ghost, a relic, a man out of time with no army, no authority, no place in this new world, and France does not need another Bonaparte, another emperor, another war. The 19th century dies in a blaze of technological optimism and approaching catastrophe that few can see, and the 20th is born in a world that Napoleon barely recognizes. So far has it moved from the one he knew. Napoleon Bonaparte, who once commanded armies across Europe with couriers and signal flags and his own tactical genius, now rides trains that cross continents in days rather than months, reads newspapers that arrive the same day events occur thanks to the telegraph, watches the first automobiles chug through city streets leaving trails of smoke and noise, and he marvels at it all. This world that has moved so far beyond the one he conquered, where information travels at the speed of lightning, and distance no longer protects or isolates nations from one another. He sees the Eiffel Tower rise in Paris for the World's Fair of 1889, a monument of iron and engineering that dwarfs anything built in his era. And he climbs to the top and looks out over the city and thinks about how small his empire seems now, how brief, how insignificant in the grand sweep of time. He settles for a time in Paris, living in a small apartment in Montmartre among artists and writers and political radicals, working as a teacher of history and mathematics at a secondary school. And he finds a quiet satisfaction in this humble life, in guiding young minds through the campaigns of Caesar and Alexander and Hannibal and yes, even Napoleon Bonaparte, whose victories and defeats he explains with a precision and insight that sometimes makes his students wonder how he knows so much, how he can describe the fog at Austerlitz or the mud at Waterloo with such vivid detail. He tells them he has studied the sources carefully, that he has read everything, every memoir and letter and military report, and they accept this explanation because he is simply Monsieur Bonaparte, an eccentric Italian scholar with old-fashioned manners and a tendency to lose himself in thought while gazing out the window at the Paris skyline. In 1914, the world plunges into war, and Napoleon watches with growing horror as Europe tears itself apart in a conflict that dwarfs even the Napoleonic Wars in scale and brutality and industrial efficiency of killing. He sees the trenches, the machine guns, the poison gas, the artillery barrages that last for days and reduce entire forests to matchsticks, the millions of men fed into the maw of industrial slaughter for gains measured in yards, and he realizes that war has fundamentally changed, that it is no longer about glory or conquest or the genius of commanders, but about logistics and production, and the grinding attrition of entire nations mobilized for total war. He thinks of Austerlitz, where his tactical brilliance and the courage of his soldiers won the day in a few hours of combat. And then he thinks of Verdun, where men die by the hundreds of thousands over 10 months for a few miles of mud and shattered stone. And he understands that his era, the age of the great captain who could win wars through personal genius, is over, replaced by something more terrible and impersonal and vast. The Great War ends, finally, after 4 years of unprecedented slaughter, and Napoleon remains in Paris, watching the victory parades down the Champs-Élysées, the returning soldiers with their haunted eyes and missing limbs, the widows and orphans and shattered men who fill the streets and cafes and hospitals, broken by a war that consumed an entire generation. He sees the Treaty of Versailles signed in the Hall of Mirrors, that same hall where the German Empire was proclaimed after defeating France in 1871, and he shakes his head because he has seen this before, seen this exact pattern, the victors demanding impossible reparations, humiliating the defeated, sowing the seeds of future conflict in the very act of making peace. He remembers the treaties he imposed on Austria and Prussia and Russia, the harsh terms that bred resentment and the desire for revenge, and he knows, with the certainty of lived experience, that this peace will not last, that the humiliation of Germany will create conditions for another war, perhaps worse than this one. In the 1920s, he continues teaching, watching as the world tries desperately to forget the war, as jazz music and cinema and radio create a new culture of mass entertainment and distraction, as the old certainties of monarchy and empire and aristocratic rule give way to democracy and nationalism, and the strange new ideologies of communism and fascism that promise to remake society from the ground up. He reads about the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, the overthrow of the Tsar, the execution of the royal family, the establishment of a workers' state that claims to be creating a new kind of human being, and he thinks of his own revolution, the one that devoured its children and gave birth to him, and he wonders if history is simply repeating itself in new costume. If humanity is doomed to cycle endlessly through the same patterns of hope and violence and disillusionment and repression. He visits Russia in the 1920s, traveling under a false passport, wanting to see for himself what the revolution has wrought, and he walks through Moscow and St. Petersburg, cities he remembers burning and abandoned, and he sees the propaganda posters and the queues for bread and the fear in people's eyes when they speak of the party and the secret police, and he recognizes all of it, has seen it all before during the Terror, when France too tried to create a new society through violence and ideology. In the 1930s, he watches with growing dread as a new kind of tyrant rises in Germany, a failed artist turned demagogue who speaks of destiny and racial purity and living space, who copies Napoleon's methods of propaganda and mass mobilization, and appeals to national glory but twists them into something dark and monstrous and fundamentally evil. Napoleon considers speaking out, writing under his own name, revealing himself to the world and using his authority and legend to warn against this rising threat. But who would believe him? And even if they did, even if he could prove his identity, would it matter? He has learned through long and painful experience that history cannot be stopped or diverted by the will of one man, no matter how great or famous or immortal, that historical forces, once set in motion, follow their own logic and momentum. The Second World War arrives like a nightmare made manifest, and Paris falls to the Germans in 1940, and Napoleon Bonaparte, who once marched victorious through every capital of Europe, who accepted the surrender of emperors and kings, now lives under occupation in the very city he made the center of his empire and the capital of European civilization. He continues teaching, though the schools are now supervised by the Nazis, the curriculum altered to serve their ideology, and he watches as France is divided, humiliated, reduced to a vassal state, forced to collaborate with its conquerors, and he feels the bitter irony of it all, because he too invaded and occupied and redrew the map of Europe according to his will. He too forced defeated nations to serve French interests. He too believed he was bringing civilization and enlightenment to backward peoples who did not appreciate his gifts. Is this his punishment? He wonders, to live long enough to see France suffer what he inflicted on others. To watch the nation he loved and served and tried to make great endure the same humiliation and occupation he imposed on Spain and Germany and Italy. He does not know, but he endures, as he has always endured, teaching his students about the American Revolution and the rights of man while Nazi officers walk the halls outside. When the Gestapo comes to his apartment one day, asking questions about a student who has joined the resistance, he answers carefully, revealing nothing, his face composed, his voice steady, drawing on decades of experience in diplomacy and deception. And after they leave, he sits by the window and remembers the guerrilla war in Spain, the ambushes and atrocities, the way his occupation there bred a hatred that never died, the way the Spanish fought with knives and rocks and desperation against his armies. He begins, quietly, to help the resistance, using his knowledge of military logistics to suggest targets for sabotage, forging documents with the same meticulous attention to detail he once applied to battle plans and administrative reforms, passing information through a network of former students who trust him without knowing who he really is. He does not fight. He is too old for that now, at least in appearance, but he contributes in small ways, acts of defiance that ease his conscience, that make him feel less complicit in the occupation. When Paris is liberated in 1944, he stands in the crowd on the Champs-Élysées and watches de Gaulle march through the city at the head of the Free French forces, and he thinks of his own triumphal entries into conquered capitals, the crowds that cheered him as liberator and hero, the glory that seemed eternal and proved so fleeting and hollow. The war ends, Europe lies in ruins, millions dead, cities destroyed, entire peoples nearly exterminated, and Napoleon Bonaparte begins to understand more fully that he will outlive everything, every nation, every ideology, every certainty, watching them all rise and fall like waves on a shore, leaving only debris and memory behind. The second half of the 20th century unfolds with dizzying speed, and Napoleon adapts, as he has always adapted, because survival requires flexibility, requires the ability to change with changing circumstances, and he has had 2 centuries now to practice this skill. He learns new languages, masters new technologies, adopts new ways of being in a world that changes faster with each passing decade, where the pace of transformation accelerates beyond anything previous generations experienced. He leaves Paris in the 1950s, needing a change of scene, needing distance from memories that have accumulated in layers like sediment, and he travels to America, to New York, where he works in a library, cataloging books, organizing archives, living alone in a small apartment in Brooklyn, and he finds a strange peace in anonymity, in being no one special, just another immigrant, another face in the crowd of millions seeking opportunity in the new world. He watches the Cold War develop, the division of Europe between East and West by an iron curtain that cuts through the heart of the continent he once united under his rule, the nuclear standoff that holds the world hostage to the threat of instant annihilation, and he marvels at how humanity has found yet another way to threaten its own existence, how the weapons have grown so powerful that they make his artillery, once the most destructive force in warfare, seem like children's toys. He sees the 1960s arrive with their revolutions and protests and cultural upheavals, the young people marching for civil rights and against war and for sexual liberation and environmental protection, and he sympathizes with them, remembers his own youth, his own belief that the world could be remade according to reason and justice and Enlightenment principles, before he learned that power corrupts even the best intentions, that ambition blinds even the clearest vision, that even revolutionaries become tyrants when they gain control. In the 1970s, he watches Watergate unfold on television, sees a president brought down by his own misdeeds and the slow grinding of democratic institutions, and he thinks of his own downfall, the hubris that led him to Moscow, the desperation that led him to Waterloo, the inability to accept limits that destroyed everything he built. The 1980s bring computers and the personal technology revolution that will transform human life as profoundly as the printing press or the steam engine, and Napoleon, who once prided himself on mastering the cutting edge of military technology and administrative science, now learns to use a computer, typing his memoirs on a word processor, though he knows he will never publish them, because how could he explain who he is, how he has survived, why he looks like a man in his 50s, when he should be dust for nearly 2 centuries. The Berlin Wall falls in 1989, and Napoleon watches on television as the Cold War ends not with the nuclear apocalypse everyone feared, but with peaceful revolution and the collapse of the Soviet Union, as the map of Europe is redrawn once again without a single shot fired in anger, and he thinks of all the maps he redrew with blood and artillery, all the kingdoms and republics he created and destroyed through force of arms, and he wonders if any of it lasts, if any human arrangement is more than temporary, a sandcastle waiting for the inevitable tide. He returns to Europe in the 1990s, to a continent that is trying, once again, to unite, not through conquest this time but through treaties and common currency and shared democratic institutions, building the European Union piece by patient piece. He visits Brussels, watches the bureaucrats and diplomats negotiate the details of integration, and he thinks that perhaps this is what he was trying to achieve, a united Europe. But he did it wrong, tried to impose it by force rather than persuasion, by the sword rather than the pen, by domination rather than cooperation. He attends lectures on European integration, sits in the back of the auditorium taking notes, an old man with white hair and reading glasses that he doesn't actually need, and afterward, sometimes, he speaks to the young scholars and policymakers, offering insights that seem strangely prescient, drawn from deep understanding of European history and the failures of past attempts at unification, and they nod politely, thinking he is just another retired professor with too much time on his hands, and an encyclopedic knowledge of 19th century politics. In the early 2000s, the internet explodes into ubiquity. Social media emerges and transforms human communication, and Napoleon, who once understood the power of propaganda and newspapers and bulletins from the Grand Army carefully crafted to shape public opinion, now sees information move at speeds that would have been unimaginable in his time, sees opinions form and shift and fragment in real time, sees the same passions and hatreds and dreams that drove his era now amplified and accelerated beyond measure by technology that connects everyone to everyone else. He creates an email address, reads online forums about history and military strategy, sometimes, anonymously, corrects misconceptions about his campaigns, explains what he was actually thinking at Austerlitz or Wagram, why he made certain decisions that seem foolish in retrospect, and a few times, people argue with him, tell him he's wrong about what Napoleon intended or thought or felt, and he smiles at the irony and lets it go. Because what does it matter, really, if strangers on the internet don't believe him when he explains his own motivations? The 21st century deepens, and Napoleon Bonaparte, who has now lived for 200 years, who has seen the world transform in ways that would have seemed like magic or madness or divine intervention to the boy from Corsica who dreamed of military glory, begins to feel the weight of his immortality in new and more profound ways. It is not physical pain. His body remains strong and unchanging, frozen at the age he was when immortality claimed him, but a weariness of the soul, a fatigue that comes from watching the same patterns repeat endlessly across different contexts, the same ambitions and follies and tragedies playing out in different costumes on different stages with different actors who think they are unique but are not. He watches the Iraq War begin with promises of quick victory and democratic transformation, sees the promises turn to occupation and insurgency and sectarian violence, and he remembers Spain, remembers how easy it was to conquer a country in a few weeks of brilliant campaigning and how impossible to hold it when the people refused to submit, when every village becomes a potential battlefield, and every shadow hides a potential assassin. He watches the financial crisis of 2008, sees banks collapse and economies crumble and millions lose their homes and savings, and he remembers the continental system he tried to impose, the economic warfare that was supposed to bring Britain to its knees and instead impoverished Europe and created the conditions for his downfall. He watches the Arab Spring erupt across the Middle East, sees dictators fall and hopes rise and then, too often, descend into chaos and civil war and the return of authoritarianism, and he remembers the French Revolution, the Terror, the Directory, the way noble ideals can curdle into violence when there is no structure to contain them, no tradition to guide them, no patience to let change occur gradually. He lives in Lyon now, in a modest apartment near the old town in a neighborhood that has somehow retained its character despite modernization, and he takes long walks along the Rhône, watching the river flow as it has always flowed, indifferent to empires and revolutions and the ambitions of men, a natural constant in a world of human inconstancy. He volunteers at a museum, giving tours of Napoleonic exhibits, explaining the weapons and uniforms and maps to tourists, and sometimes visitors ask him how he knows so much, how he speaks about the period with such vividness and authority, as though he were there, and he tells them he has studied it all his life, which is true, in a way, because he has been studying his own life, his own decisions, for 2 centuries now, trying to understand what he did right and what he did wrong and whether any of it mattered in the end. In 2015, he attends the bicentennial commemoration of Waterloo, traveling to Belgium on a train that covers in 2 hours a distance that once took his army days of marching, standing in the crowd near the Lion's Mound, listening to speeches about reconciliation and European unity and the importance of remembering history so we do not repeat it. He listens to these platitudes and thinks how little they understand, how history is not a lesson to be learned but a force to be endured, how the same mistakes are made again and again not because people forget but because human nature does not change, because each generation believes it is wiser than the last when in fact it is only different. He watches reenactors dress in period uniforms and stage mock battles on the field where he met his final defeat, and the spectacle is both moving and absurd, a sanitized version of the horror, the real battle reduced to entertainment, the screams and blood and death transformed into pageantry. He wears sunglasses and a hat, keeps his distance from the cameras and reporters, but he feels the pull of memory so strongly it almost overwhelms him. He can still hear the guns, still see the squares of British infantry holding firm against his cavalry charges, still feel the moment when he knew it was over, that Blücher's Prussians had arrived on the field and his last gamble had failed and everything he fought for was lost. An older woman standing next to him, a tourist with a guidebook and comfortable shoes, asks if he's all right, and he realizes he's crying, tears running down his face unchecked, and he wipes them away with embarrassment and nods and says he's fine, just moved by history, by the weight of remembering, and she smiles with understanding and says she knows what he means, that there's something powerful about standing where great events occurred, where the fate of nations was decided. He wants to tell her that he was there, that he commanded the French forces, that this is not history for him but memory, vivid and painful and impossible to escape. But of course he says nothing, only thanks her for her concern and walks away, and later, alone in his hotel room, he writes in his journal about the strange torture of immortality, the way the past never fades, never softens into comfortable nostalgia, never becomes distant enough to lose its power to wound, but remains always present, always sharp, always immediate, an eternal now that encompasses 200 years of accumulated experience and loss. The 2010s pass into the 2020s, and the world is gripped by a pandemic, a virus that spreads across the globe in weeks and brings modern civilization to a halt in ways that war and depression never quite managed, and Napoleon Bonaparte, who survived countless battlefields and witnessed plagues sweep through his armies in Egypt and Russia, who saw typhus and dysentery kill more men than enemy bullets, now lives through lockdowns and masks and the strange quiet of empty streets in cities that are usually loud with human activity. He spends his time reading, writing, watching the news coverage of the global crisis with the detachment of someone who has seen similar crises before, and he thinks about how much has changed and how much remains the same. Because disease is still disease, fear is still fear, death is still death. And people still look to their leaders for answers and reassurance, and too often find only confusion and incompetence and the fumbling response of institutions unprepared for catastrophe. He watches the political upheavals that follow the pandemic, the riots and protests, the rise of populism and nationalism and conspiracy theories, the fracturing of the consensus that seemed so solid just a few years ago, and he recognizes all of it, has seen all of it before in different forms, the same human impulses dressed in contemporary language, the same search for scapegoats and simple answers to complex problems, the same desire to return to an imagined past that never existed. He considers writing a book, finally, using a pseudonym, something about the cycles of history, the patterns that repeat across centuries, the lessons that are never learned because each generation must learn them anew through bitter experience, but he knows it would be ignored or dismissed as the work of another armchair historian, another academic with a theory. Because who would believe that the author has actually lived through these cycles multiple times, has seen them from the inside, has been both architect and victim of history's grand designs. So he continues in silence, a guardian of memories no one else possesses, a witness to the long arc of time that bends toward nothing in particular, that simply continues, indifferent to human hopes and fears and dreams of progress. He moves back to Ajaccio, Corsica, his birthplace, coming full circle after 2 centuries of wandering, and buys a small house overlooking the sea, and there, surrounded by the landscape of his childhood, he tends a garden and feeds stray cats and watches the sunset over the Mediterranean, and sometimes tourists stop and ask him if he knows anything about Napoleon Bonaparte, since this is his hometown after all. And he smiles and says a little, not much, just what everyone knows, and they thank him and move on, never suspecting that they have just spoken to the man himself. He thinks often now about the concept of legacy, about what lasts and what fades, about what we leave behind and whether it matters in the infinite sweep of time, and he realizes that even his own legacy, once so grand and terrible that it dominated an entire era, has been softened by time, sanitized for public consumption, turned into tourist attractions and historical debates and romantic myth that bears little resemblance to the complex reality he lived. People name streets after him, visit his tomb at Les Invalides where his body does not lie, buy books about his military genius and passionate love affairs, and they forget, or never knew, about the millions who died in his wars, the cities that burned, the families that were destroyed, the suffering that his ambition caused across an entire continent. He does not know if this is good or bad, this forgetting, only that it is inevitable, that time erodes everything, even the memory of atrocity, and turns it into story, into entertainment, into something that happened long ago to people who are no longer real, who have become characters in a historical drama rather than flesh and blood human beings who felt pain and fear and love. He receives an email one day from a doctoral student at the Sorbonne writing a dissertation on the Russian campaign of 1812, asking if he would be willing to be interviewed about his research on the period, having found his name on a discussion forum where he posted detailed analysis of Napoleon's supply situation, and he agrees out of curiosity, and they meet in a cafe in Ajaccio, and the young man, earnest and intelligent and passionate about his subject, asks him question after question about logistics and supply lines and the decision to continue toward Moscow even as winter approached and the army began to disintegrate. Napoleon answers carefully, drawing on the official histories, the memoirs of participants like Caulaincourt and Segur, the documents in the archives, but also on his own memory, the thing he can never mention, the direct experience of making those decisions under conditions of imperfect information and tremendous pressure, and he sees the young man's eyes light up with excitement as he scribbles notes furiously. And Napoleon thinks that this is what history becomes, notes in a margin, arguments in footnotes, abstraction piled upon abstraction until the reality, the blood and mud and terror and confusion, disappears entirely behind layers of analysis and interpretation. When the interview is over, the young man thanks him profusely, says his insights are remarkable, asks if he has considered publishing his own work on the Napoleonic period, and Napoleon says no, he prefers to remain private, to contribute in small ways without seeking recognition, and they shake hands and part. And Napoleon walks back to his house along the waterfront and sits on the terrace and watches the sea and thinks that perhaps this is enough to help one student understand a little better, to pass on some small fragment of truth, even if the larger truth, the truth of who he is and what he has witnessed and how he has survived, must remain forever hidden. The world continues its acceleration toward futures Napoleon can barely imagine, futures that seem more like fantasy than possibility, artificial intelligence that matches or exceeds human cognition, gene editing that allows humanity to rewrite its own biology, climate change that threatens to make large parts of the Earth uninhabitable, the colonization of Mars and dreams of spreading human civilization beyond this single fragile planet. And he wonders if he will live to see these things, if his immortality will extend that far into the future, or if there is some natural limit he has not yet reached, some point at which even his impossible existence will finally end. He reads about the technological singularity, the point at which artificial intelligence surpasses human intelligence and begins improving itself in recursive cycles that lead to incomprehensible transformation, and he wonders if machines will succeed where he failed, if they will finally create the rational, ordered world that the Enlightenment promised and the French Revolution sought and his empire attempted to impose through force and law and administrative efficiency. Or perhaps they will simply repeat the same patterns on a larger scale, the same cycles of creation and destruction, because perhaps those patterns are not merely human but universal, written into the fabric of existence itself, the eternal dance of order and chaos that plays out across all levels of reality. He takes up painting in what would be his old age if he aged, and he paints scenes from his memory, not the grand battles or coronations that everyone knows, but small moments that no one else remembers. A sunrise over the Egyptian desert, during the campaign there when he was still young and believed himself invincible. A quiet street in Paris before the Revolution when the old order still seemed eternal and unchangeable. The view from his window on Saint Helena before his recovery, when he thought he was dying and felt a strange peace at the prospect of finally resting. He paints these memories with careful attention to detail, trying to capture not just the visual appearance but the feeling, the quality of light and air, the emotional texture of the moment, and then he burns them, because he does not want anyone to see them, to analyze them, to turn them into clues about his identity or evidence of his impossible survival. The act of painting is enough, the act of remembering and rendering and then releasing, letting the images exist briefly before consigning them to ash and memory. He corresponds with historians occasionally, always anonymously or under different pseudonyms, offering insights through email and online forums, correcting errors he sees in scholarship, suggesting new interpretations of well-known events. And he has become, without anyone knowing it, a kind of invisible collaborator in the study of his own era, shaping how it is understood and taught and remembered, ensuring that certain truths are not forgotten even if his own truth, the truth of his survival and immortality, remains unknown and unknowable. In 2025, on the anniversary of his original coronation in 1804, 221 years after that audacious moment when he placed the crown upon his own head, Napoleon Bonaparte stands alone in Notre Dame Cathedral, which has been painstakingly restored after the fire of 2019 that nearly destroyed it. And he looks at the spot where he crowned himself emperor in front of the Pope and all the assembled dignitaries of Europe, where he made his definitive break with the past and declared himself the equal of Charlemagne. The cathedral is empty at this early hour, only a few cleaners preparing for the day's tourists, and he stands there in the shadows among the columns and the filtered light, remembering that moment with perfect clarity, every detail still vivid after more than 2 centuries, the weight of the golden crown in his hands, the gasps from the assembled crowd when they realized what he was about to do, the look of surprise and then reluctant acceptance on everyone's faces, because he was Napoleon. And by then they expected the extraordinary from him, had learned that he would always exceed expectations and break rules and remake reality according to his will. He wonders what that young man, that 35-year-old emperor at the height of his power and confidence, would think if he could see himself now, 221 years later, alive and unknown, a phantom haunting the edges of history, possessing all the knowledge and experience that young emperor lacked but none of the power or glory. Would he be horrified, disappointed? Would he curse this immortality as the cruelest punishment imaginable? Or would he understand, as Napoleon understands now after 2 centuries of life and reflection, that survival is its own kind of victory, that to witness and remember and endure is perhaps more important than glory, more meaningful than conquest, because glory fades like morning mist and conquest crumbles like sand, but memory, true memory, the lived experience of history preserved in an immortal consciousness, is precious beyond measure even when it is painful, even when it is unbearable, even when the weight of it threatens to crush the soul. He leaves the cathedral as the first tourists begin to arrive, walks through the streets of Paris in the early morning light, and the city is waking up around him with the familiar rhythms of urban life, people hurrying to work, cafes opening their doors and setting out tables on the sidewalks, the metro rumbling beneath his feet carrying millions to their destinations, and he is part of it and apart from it simultaneously. A man out of time who has learned to live in time, who has made peace, as much as possible, with his condition and his fate. He thinks about the future now more than the past, which is a significant change, a shift in perspective that has taken decades to achieve, because for so long he lived primarily in memory, in regret and analysis and the endless replaying of decisions and battles and lost opportunities. But now, having lived through so much change, having seen the world transform in ways he could never have predicted when he was emperor or even when he was wandering through the 19th century, he wonders what comes next, what the 21st century will bring in its remaining decades, what challenges and crises and transformations await humanity as it stumbles forward into an uncertain future. He reads extensively about climate change, the warming planet, the rising seas, the extinction of species, the disruption of weather patterns, and he wonders if this will be the thing that finally humbles humanity, the problem too large and too diffuse for any empire or ideology or technology to solve through unilateral action, requiring instead cooperation on a scale that humans have never managed to achieve. He thinks about his own campaigns, the way he marched hundreds of thousands of men across Europe, burning forests for fuel, consuming resources, living off the land and leaving devastation in his wake, and he realizes that he too contributed, in his small way, to this crisis that now threatens civilization, that every human action has consequences that ripple forward through time in ways we cannot predict or control, that the carbon his armies released into the atmosphere is still there, warming the planet infinitesimally. He joins a local environmental group in Corsica, volunteers for beach cleanups and tree plantings and educational programs about conservation, and the other volunteers, mostly young people passionate about saving the planet, accept him as just another concerned citizen, an older man who has time to give and wisdom to share. And he likes this role, likes being useful in a humble way, likes the feeling that he is contributing to something larger than himself without need for domination or command or recognition. One of the young volunteers, a woman in her 20s with fierce intelligence and determination, asks him one day why he cares so much about the environment, what motivates him, and he tells her that he has seen what happens when we do not care for the world, when we take and destroy without thought for tomorrow or for future generations. And she nods and says that's very wise, and he smiles, because wisdom is just experience given time to ferment, and he has more experience than she could possibly imagine, more than any human in history. The question that haunts him most, as he moves through the mid-2020s, as the world continues to change and evolve around him while he remains constant, is whether he should reveal himself, whether the time has finally come to step out of the shadows and tell the world who he is, what he has witnessed, what he has learned through 2 centuries of observation and reflection. He imagines the scenario in detail, plays it out in his mind, the headlines, the scientific investigations, the medical tests, the media frenzy that would consume his life, the governments that would want to study him, perhaps imprison him for research, perhaps use him as a weapon or a propaganda tool or a symbol. He imagines the conspiracy theories that would flourish, the religious interpretations of his immortality as divine blessing or demonic curse, the people who would worship him as a prophet and the people who would hate him as an abomination, the endless questions about how he survived, what he knows, what the secret is. And he decides, again and again after each time he considers it, that silence is better, that secrecy is wiser, that his contribution to the world is not to be Napoleon the returned emperor, Napoleon the immortal, Napoleon the living legend, but simply to be another person, flawed and striving, trying to live well and do good in small ways without the burden of fame or the corruption of power. He writes a letter to himself, a document he will never send to anyone else, in which he explains his choice in careful detail, and in it he says that he has learned, finally, after 2 centuries of observation and painful experience, that the individual, no matter how great or talented or ambitious, cannot change the course of history alone. That history is made by millions of small choices by ordinary people living their lives, and that the best thing he can do is be one of those ordinary people, contributing his small part to the great collective endeavor of human civilization, adding his voice to the chorus without trying to drown out all the others. He seals the letter and places it in a drawer with other documents he has written over the years, knowing he will read it again someday when doubt returns, when the loneliness of immortality becomes too heavy to bear, when he needs to remind himself why he chooses to remain hidden, why silence is sometimes the greatest wisdom. The world continues to change around him with ever-increasing speed, new technologies that seem miraculous, new conflicts that seem depressingly familiar, new hopes that seem fragile, new fears that seem justified, and Napoleon Bonaparte continues with it, walking forward into a future that is always arriving and always becoming past, always adding to the vast accumulation of memory that he carries within him like a sacred burden that he cannot put down and would not put down even if he could. He develops a routine, a life that is quiet and sustainable and unremarkable, because he has learned that sustainability is what matters over the long term, not glory or intensity or the highs and lows of dramatic existence, but the ability to continue, day after day, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, finding meaning in small things and peace in ordinary rhythms. He wakes early each morning as the sun rises over the Mediterranean, makes coffee using a French press, a small connection to his national identity, reads the news on a tablet computer that still amazes him with its casual access to all the world's information, tends his garden where he grows tomatoes and herbs and flowers, writes in his journals which now fill an entire closet, goes for long walks along the coastal paths, talks to his neighbors about weather and politics and local gossip, volunteers at the library helping people find books and navigate computers, helps tourists find their way when they look lost, and in these small acts, repeated daily with quiet dedication, he finds a contentment that eluded him when he was emperor, when he commanded armies and ruled nations and sought to reshape the world in his image according to his vision. He has come to understand, slowly and with much resistance because it contradicts everything his younger self believed, that power is a trap, that it promises fulfillment and delivers only hunger for more power, that true peace comes not from domination but from acceptance, from finding one's place in the world and being at peace with it, from contributing without needing to control. Sometimes he meets people who remind him of figures from his past, and these encounters are both painful and sweet. A young officer in the French army with the same bearing and courage as Ney, a scholar with the same penetrating intelligence and cynical wisdom as Talleyrand, a woman with the same regal grace and complicated charm as Josephine, a baker with the same practical competence as one of his marshals whose name he can no longer remember, and he feels the past press close, feels the weight of memory threatening to overwhelm the present, but he does not dwell on it, only notes the resemblance and moves on, because the past is past, and these are new people living new lives in a new century, and they deserve to be seen for who they are, not as echoes of the dead or reminders of what he has lost. He attends concerts and lectures, watches films and plays, reads novels and poetry voraciously, and he marvels at human creativity, at the way each generation finds new ways to express the same fundamental experiences of love and loss and hope and despair and longing and joy. He sees a production of War and Peace, Tolstoy's great novel that features him as a character, and he watches his fictional self on stage, watches an actor portray him as a force of history, a man driven by destiny and doomed by hubris, and he thinks how strange it is to see oneself from the outside, to be both subject and observer, participant and audience, the person who lived the history and the person who watches it be performed and interpreted and transformed into art. He begins to write, finally, not the memoirs he has always thought he should write but fiction, stories set in different periods and places, drawing on his vast knowledge of history but transforming it, imagining different outcomes, different choices, different worlds where things went differently. He publishes them under a pseudonym, Jean Colonna, a name that hints at his Corsican origins without revealing them, and the stories receive modest attention, a few good reviews in literary journals, a small but devoted readership, and he is content with this because the writing itself is the point, the act of creation, the transformation of memory and knowledge into art and story. He writes a story about a soldier who survives every battle through impossible luck and returns home after decades of war to find the world changed beyond recognition and must learn to live in peace. and the critics say it is a profound meditation on war and memory and the difficulty of reintegration. And they are right, though they do not know how autobiographical it is, how closely it mirrors his own experience. He writes a story about an emperor who abdicates his throne and lives in obscurity for years, learning to be ordinary, learning humility, learning that power is not the same as happiness, and the critics say it is about redemption and the possibility of change. And again they are right, though they do not know the story is, in a sense, about his own 2-century journey from emperor to ordinary citizen. He attends a small literary festival in Ajaccio, reads one of his stories to an audience of perhaps 30 people in a bookshop, and afterward a woman approaches him and asks where he gets his ideas, and he says from history, from observation, from the understanding that human nature does not change fundamentally even as the world transforms around us, and she says that comes through powerfully in his work, that sense of deep time, of patterns repeating, of the eternal beneath the temporal, and he thanks her and feels a small satisfaction, because this is what he hoped to convey, this sense of the long arc, the continuity beneath the change. He thinks about death sometimes, wonders if it will ever come for him, if there is some unknown limit to his immortality, some point at which whatever force or phenomenon keeps him alive will finally release him, if one day he will simply wake up and feel mortality returning like sensation to a numbed limb. And he finds that he is not afraid of this prospect anymore, that after 2 centuries of life, death would be a kind of rest, a release from the burden of endless memory and endless continuation. But he is not eager for it either, not actively seeking it, because there is still so much to see, so much to learn, so much that he wants to understand about this endlessly fascinating and frustrating species to which he belongs. Now it is 2026, and Napoleon Bonaparte is 256 years old, older than anyone has ever been, older than anyone should be. And the world stands on the edge of changes he can sense but not yet see, the way a sailor senses a storm before it arrives, reading subtle signs in the wind and waves and the behavior of birds, drawing on experience accumulated over countless voyages. He sits on his terrace in Ajaccio, in a comfortable chair he bought at a local furniture store, looking out at the Mediterranean, the same sea he looked at as a child when he dreamed of glory and conquest and making his mark on history. And he has done all of that and more, achieved everything his younger self wanted, and learned that achievement is not the same as fulfillment, that success is not the same as happiness, that fame is not the same as meaning. He does not know what the future holds, whether humanity will solve its existential problems or destroy itself in the trying, whether the patterns he has witnessed will continue indefinitely or finally break and transform into something new, whether he will live another century or another millennium or forever, an eternal witness to humanity's endless cycle of creation and destruction. And he has learned to accept this not knowing, to embrace the uncertainty that is the only constant in a universe of change, to find peace in the present moment rather than anxiously grasping for control of a future that cannot be controlled. He thinks of all the people he has known and loved and lost, all the faces that have faded into history while he remains unchanging, and he carries them with him always, keeps them alive in memory, speaks their names quietly to himself sometimes just to prove they existed, because that is what the living owe the dead, to remember, to honor, to ensure that they are not forgotten even when everyone else who knew them has also died. A neighbor's child runs by, chasing a ball that bounces down the street, laughing with pure unself-conscious joy, and Napoleon watches and smiles. And he thinks that this is what matters, this continuity, this passing of life from one generation to the next, this endless renewal that makes all his struggles and triumphs and failures seem small by comparison. Because life continues, life persists, life endures, with or without emperors, with or without glory, with or without him, the great river of existence flowing forward regardless of what any individual does or does not do. And so he sits, Napoleon Bonaparte, emperor and exile, conqueror and wanderer, legend and ghost, war hero and peace seeker, watching the sun set over the sea in a display of orange and purple and gold that he has seen thousands of times but still finds beautiful. And the night comes as it always comes, and the stars appear in their familiar constellations, and the world turns on its axis as it has turned for billions of years, and time flows forward, always forward, carrying him with it into the unknown, into the endless becoming that is history, that is existence, that is the strange and terrible and beautiful gift of immortality. And he breathes, and he lives, and he continues, a witness to the ages, a guardian of memory, a thread connecting past to present to future, and he accepts it all, the burden and the blessing, the joy and the sorrow, the infinite weight of 2 centuries of life and the infinite possibility of centuries yet to come.